my career. And in this series, which is going to contain at least 15 videos, maybe more, I'm going to show you a number of patterns that you can use in your own games. So we're going to start off with the fairly simple ones, and then we're going to go to more abstract ones that you may have not seen. This first video is concentrating on Fool's Mate, which is the quickest checkmate possible. So called because only a fool will fall into it. And there is some alliteration from me. That's why I'm a grandmaster. So, what is Fool's Mate? Well, let's show you the very basics of it first. Fool's Mate is where white plays something along the lines of f3, and now after a move like e5, opening up the bishop and the queen, the horrendous move g4. And this is such a bad move because black can now take advantage of this weakened diagonal, the h4 e1 diagonal, by playing queen to h4, checkmate. Not a good way to finish the game from white. Now, Fool's Mate is really something you shouldn't see too often. It's a checkmate where one side has to be very cooperative. Because in this example, white has to play bad moves in order to lose. Black doesn't do anything special. So really Fool's Mate is something which occurs when one player plays very badly at the start of the game. And Fool's Mate is really the most important characteristics of this is the weakening of this diagonal, if white is the fool, or some cases the weakening of this diagonal, the h5 e8 diagonal, if black is the fool. So let's have a look at a couple more examples of this. Okay, well, in another game, white started with d4, and he lost only a couple of moves later. You might be thinking, how? Well, knight to f6 was played by black, and now knight to d2. Already a rather surprising and inferior move. This blocks in the bishop, and also the pawn on d4 now has no protection from the queen. So the knight is not on a good square. Black aims to take advantage of this by playing e5, a kind of gambit line to gain a bit of time and to try to trap white. It works perfectly. White grabs that pawn. Now black places his knight upon g4, aiming to win back the pawn, but also with some other ideas in mind. White gives the knight a kick, thinking, okay, I'll give my pawn back, but I'll be safe. But he misses a really important move now. Can you see the move? Knight to e3, a devastating move. And in this position, white resigned only on move 4. Oh my words, imagine that happening. Because he's going to lose his queen, and that's quite serious. Or if he captures the knight again, he has weakened this diagonal. Remember, for Fool's Mate, this diagonal, when it's happening to white, is the key diagonal. And after queen to h4 check, it's worth noting the white pawn is on h3, so you can't really go g3 before that pawn is defended, because queen takes g3 is checkmate. Again, another example is Fool's Mate. Now, in order for this to work, really one side has to play a loosening move like f4, f5, or move their g-pawn and move their g-pawn. So another example of this, which has occurred actually in far too many games, is when white goes f4. So already white is asking for this diagonal to come under attack. This is not a serious problem if white knows what he's doing. But here, a very dangerous reply to this is the From's gambit, e5. It's slightly in the same spirit as the last gambit we saw. Black gives up a pawn to gain quick development. And here there are two ways white can fall into Fool's gambit. Number one is if he tries to guard his pawn with the very bad move g3. The point being, after pawn takes f4, white should now not take pawn because he's weakened his diagonal, and queen to h4 is yet another example of Fool's Mate. One of my favourites Fool's Mate that I show juniors I'm teaching is if white captures on e5 and now black plays d6, trying to accelerate his development after pawn takes d6, bishop takes d6, and also creating a deadly threat. Can you see the threat here? Well, it's often happened where white hasn't seen the threat and has played a move like knight to c3, really not paying attention to his weakened diagonal. Now queen to h4 check, and it's going to be checkmate very quickly. White has to play g3, but in this example, black has two pieces attacking that pawn. So black can play even queen takes g3, and I have to say, I love sacrificing my queen. So I'd rather take care of my queen than my bishop, because my opponent might get excited. I love showing kids this, because the kids go, I can win your queen! Yay! But after the bishop takes g3, you might win my queen, but you lose the game. Thank you very much. And we've only looked at this so far from the example of white being the fool. So now let's have a look at one last example of black now being the fool. And after the starting move pawn to d4, f5 is a move I often play, the so-called Dutch defence. And one line which is very tricky is now bishop g5, where black can try to chase this bishop away with h6. The bishop moves, and now g5. And now let's say the bishop moves again. Black has to be very careful here, because he's moved his f-pawn and his g-pawn, weakening the diagonal towards his king. So if he continues with f4, a much better move, by the way, would have been knight to f6, because that covers more squares, develops a piece. White can now play e3, and already queen to h5 is a threat. One very attractive game that occurred in this position between Teed and Delmar in 1896 occurred h5, trying to stop the queen coming in, and now a very surprising move, bishop d3, because again you leave your bishop on pre here, rook to h6, defending that square, but white has a forced checkmate here. Can you work out the rook is the only defender of that square, so you need to distract the rook. Queen takes h5. Don't you just love the way I'm finding ways to sacrifice my queen with fool's mate already? Rook takes h5, and now, because the rook no longer defends g6, bishop g6 checkmate. So fool's mate is really our first introduction to this series of checkmate patterns. Now don't fear if you're a high-rated player. I have to start from the bottom and move through all the ones. But in the next couple of examples, they're already going to get much tougher. And I'm going to try to give simple cases and much more complex cases for each checkmate pattern. Like I said, I really didn't realise how many names, how many different checkmates there were out there. And this course and this series has really helped me just confirming those patterns, and that's my aim in this, to try to get you to think about these patterns, try to subconsciously remember them when you're playing your own games. So thank you for watching this video. This video concentrates on the back rank checkmate, something that can be very simple or very complex. Our first example here actually is from a World Champions game, Capablanca with the black pieces. This was played in an exhibition match. White now played knight to b5. And we're going to see a sequence here which demonstrates how one side's back rank can be very weak and how you can take advantage of it. You can see that both kings here have three pawns in front of them. So the kings are kind of lacking any oxygen. They can't escape. So if a rook or a queen was able to come down to the back rank, this is the back rank here, the king would be trapped. And this is precisely what Capablanca does. He now, after knight to b5, moves his rook to c5. And I'm sure he must have seen the sequence in advance. White now thinks, happy days, I can win a pawn on c3. And he plays knight takes c3, but the world champion Capablanca had seen a little bit further. Knight takes c3, and you can see here the more pieces that get exchanged, the weaker White's back rank becomes. Rook takes c3, and now after rook takes c3, White plays rook takes c3, and the danger bells should be ringing because there is no protection for White on the back rank. But the next move is certainly a very special move here, because it may look like black comes all the way down with queen to b1 check here, but this is actually easily defended. White can go queen to f1. And now if the queens get exchanged, White is a pawn up in the ending. And if black plays the horrendously bad move, rook to d1, black has now left his back rank open. So the rook comes to c8 with checkmate. So what is the move that black needs to play here? Well, again, this series of videos is all about recognizing patterns. If you recognize your opponent's king is trapped in, it's lacking oxygen, you should be looking at ways to divert your opponent's pieces away from the defense of the back rank, to try to get your own pieces into the back rank, and you should be calculating at a much more in-depth level than you would do if these danger signs were not ringing in your ears. In this position, black can play the amazing move queen to b2. This diverts the queen away from f1, and white is completely lost here. For example, if white goes queen takes b2, rook to d1 is already checkmate. There is no longer a defensive move like queen to f1. What else can white play here? Well, not too much. If, for example, white plays queen to e1, trying to defend the back rank, black can now again try to divert that queen away from defense by playing queen takes c3, and then rook to d1, checkmate, coming up next move. So this is very simple. I say simple, it's actually a little bit complex, but this is taken from a real game, a World Championship game. And we're now going to look at another example, which is quite a lot more complex. And, you know, those of you at a high level here might even struggle with this next example. So let's move there now. So this more complex example is taken from a very renowned chess player, Tartakova. And we dive into a seemingly harmless position where white now has to take the piece back on g5, otherwise it's going to be a piece down. Rook takes g5. But again, what are the important factors, the important patterns that should be raising alarm signals in your mind? Well, the rook on g5 is a long way out to play. It should be protecting that back rank. It's not really doing anything on g5. It's really misplaced there. So black also has the open f-file for his rook, and the queen may be able to find a way in. Can you think what black should be trying to do here? It's very pretty what black now plays. Really, the one thing you've got to remember is the f1 square is key. If you can try to force the king to h1 and get the queen away from the back rank, the rook can come in there. And you can do this through a series of force moves. And force moves are always the things you should be looking for in chess, mainly. Always start with the force moves. Now, in this position, Tartakova played queen b6 check. He could have gone queen c5 straight away, but this is more picturesque. There's only one move white can play, king to h1. Now, again, look for force moves here. Is there any way black can create a threat? Now, there are a couple of moves that are maybe a little bit superficial. I mean, maybe a move such as queen to b4 gets your attention, because you're trying to divert the queen away. So if queen takes b4, you have rook to f1 checkmate. But when you're looking at patterns, when you're calculating, you always must consider your opponent's best defense. And in this position, white can get his rook back in the game with a move such as rook takes e5, and white may even be winning here, having a two-pawn advantage. So it's more important in this position to not allow that rook in the game, but create another threat which leaves white's rook struggling there. So now queen to b5, threatening either rook to f1 or queen to f1, with checkmate or the win of the queen coming up. And look how the queen sneaks its way into the position. It's very, very nice. King to g1, the only way to defend this square. Queen to c5 check, sneaking in. Of course, we know he could have played this earlier, but I like the way he does this. King to h1, how can you make progress? You want to get the black queen into the most active square. Queen to c4, it's slowly coming into white's half. Again, the threat is rook to f1. King to g1 is the only move. Queen to d4 check. King to h1. And black has now moved the queen from a rather passive d6 square into a much more active square on d4. Look at that square, very powerful square. Now again, there are a number of options here. Try to think what you would play, because you could be tempted to play queen d3. Is that the right move? Remember that the key factors in this pattern that you should be looking for is the white queen is on the best square it can be on. At the moment, it's defending. If you can maneuver that queen elsewhere, then you may well win very easily. So pause the video if you need to. Well, here, queen to e4 is the best move. You're really placing the queen under so much trouble. Again, if queen takes e4, rook to f1 is mate. The queen is struggling for squares. And after the game continuation, queen to c1, you can work out other continuations yourself at home. Black can now go queen to d3, and the point is here, white queen's on a lot worse square. King to g1, the only way to stop f1. And again, this is not so easy, but there is a way to do this. Queen to d4 check, king to h1, and now the key move, which certainly has big similarities to the last game of Capablanca's. It's to do with the queen and the rook. Hopefully after seeing Capablanca's game, you can spot this move. Again, pause the video if you need to. What is the best way to win this position? Queen to d2. If you went queen takes b2 here, that is okay, but queen to d2, trying to divert the queen away from the back rank, also tries to pick up a rook on g5. And of course, now white has no defense. If the queen moves, we take the rook. If we take black queen, we have bang! Checkmate on the back rank. So there's some examples of the back rank checkmate. And this comes up a lot in chess. I'm sure you're well aware of this. But I particularly like that last example, which really is a beautiful demonstration of misplaced pieces as well. And like I said, they're going to get a lot harder, these checkmate patterns. Let's move on to the other one. We now move on to a checkmate which I call the kiss of death. I heard this when I was taught in Richmond, and the whole point of this checkmate is you use your queen to deliver a deadly checkmate to your opponent's king. In this case, queen to e7, you can see the queen is giving the opponent's king that deadly kiss, hence the kiss of death checkmate. Now, this is a very basic example of this pattern, and there are a number of different ways this can occur. For example, here the king is defending the queen, which of course is key. The black king cannot take the queen, can't move into the king's range. But you can have a number of other pieces defending the queen. You can have a pawn, for example, you can have a knight, a bishop, a rook. But the kiss of death checkmate is really where the queen comes right in front of the opposing king, delivering checkmate. Now we're going to take a look at some much more complex examples of this checkmate. And again, we're going to look out for things that you should be noting when you are playing your own games. How can you actually get these checkmates to work? What should you be looking for? Let's move on to another example now to jump into, actually I'm afraid, my brain. I'm now taking the black pieces, playing against a very strong ex-Russian grandmaster over 2600. This game got the best game prize in the Isle of Man competition about 10 years ago. You can see my pieces converging around my opponent's king, and already my pattern recognition is going spider sense. My queen is very near my opponent's king. I'm threatening rook takes h3 here with mate to follow. My opponent plays rook d1. In order to deliver checkmate, you need to throw your pieces into the attack. I don't have anything immediate here, so I move my knight around, knight to f6. My opponent aims to swap the queens off with queen to e1, but now a devastating technique, a devastating tactical sequence. Now, why does this work, and how does this relate to the kiss of death? Well, the key thing about this combination we're going to see here is that it works because of the threat of the kiss of death checkmate. So when you're trying to spot these kind of patterns in your own games, and you're trying to improve your sense of when to attack, you should really be looking at certain signs. For example, here, I have a queen, rook, knight, and bishop, all potentially attacking my opponent's king, which means there's very likely to be a breakthrough, especially as my opponent doesn't have any pieces near his king. Look at his pieces are all over on the other side of the board. So I should be looking for a blast. I should be looking for a breakthrough. Like I mentioned before, you've got to look for the most forcing moves, ways to open up your opponent's king. That is normally checks. So all I did here, I was looking for checks and captures that forced a sequence of moves. And I was also looking at threats. So the first move I looked at, I didn't need to look at any other moves. I certainly don't want to exchange queens because then I won't be able to checkmate my opponent, was rook takes h3. And this works a treat. Pawn takes h3, queen takes h3 check, king to g1, and can you now see my idea which combines this very important concept of the kiss of death. And this will improve in all your games. As you become a better chess player, you will recognise certain things which will lead to these checkmate patterns. Here, the key thing is actually the bishop and my queen having the potential to come into g2. So what is the move here? And if there's not a check that does anything good, and if there's not a capture which really creates a good threat, you should be looking at threats. Pause if you need to. Knight to g4. Hey ho, here we come. Over the top, boys. And the point of this is that if white tries to take that knight, we see how the kiss of death is a very important concept. My queen would just come into g2 with checkmate. And after knight g4, my opponent is in a very bad situation because I'm threatening queen to h2 and queen to f1 checkmate, which is extremely hard to stop, nearly impossible. And my opponent went on to lose this position. My attack was too strong. Now, I want to show you one more example of the kiss of death, a very beautiful example which shows great vision from one of England's best players. So let's move over to that quickly now. So the player in the white piece, as I mentioned, is Nigel Short, and this is maybe his immortal chess game. This is really a chess game that every chess player needs to know. Now we're just going to look at a position after move 30 where black plays h5. Now again, you may be thinking, how on earth is the kiss of death relevant to this position? Well, we're going to see it is, and when you start to recognize these patterns, you start to try to think of how you can create these patterns. You can work backwards and try to think of a sequence of events that leads to the pattern. So as we know, the kiss of death is where the queen comes in front of the opponent's king. But how on earth is the white queen going to get to g7 here without being taken? Well, it's an amazing, amazing idea here. And another reason this works is because black is so tied down. Black doesn't have any active possibilities. Nigel now played king to h2. You may be thinking, why on earth is this scary? That's nothing. What is that move? We'll take a look. Rook to c8, and now king to g3. Can you see Nigel's idea yet? The rook goes back to e8 because Timman can't move anything. King to f4. And here, again, black is pretty helpless. He plays bishop to c8, attacking the rook. Even Nigel's play is confusing me here. What would you play now? Would you move your rook, which is attacked, or do you have another idea? Remember the kiss of death checkmate. This is the pattern you're going for here, and you can force the win here. Pause if you need to. King to g5, and this is the absolutely beautiful idea behind this play. And the point of this is, after bishop takes d7, I must point out here that Timman actually resigned here. He hasn't got defence such as king h7 because Nigel now has queen takes g6 check. Quite surprisingly, the pawn on f7 is pinned. And the whole point is, after bishop takes d7, the king finishes its triumphant march with king to h6, and there's no way black can stop the kiss of death checkmate with queen to g7. And again, this video is really trying to demonstrate various examples from real play, real examples from games when this checkmate has been the deciding factor. So you need to have these ideas in mind. If your queen is dangerously placed around your opponent's king, look at ways you can try to create this kiss of death checkmate. And I especially like this last example, but of course I enjoy my checkmate more. Okay, loads more of these puzzles to come. Please stay tuned for my other videos. We now move on to one of the oldest checkmate patterns that was ever published, the Damiano checkmate. And apparently this first was published in 1512. So maybe some people at chess.com can still remember this puzzle. But it was actually failed to be shown on any databases because in the original publication, Damiano, who came up with this checkmate, did not place the white king on the board, which is a schoolboy error. Now, what is this checkmate? Well, have a look at the following position here. Can you see a way for white to force checkmate? Well, he can do this by first giving up his rook to h8 check. And the key things to remember about this checkmate is if you have an open Harry file, H file, if you have a pawn or bishop on g6, and your opponent's king is on g8, this pattern can often occur. And what you're really trying to do is just get your queen from d1 or wherever it is on the board to h7. This is the key idea of the Damiano checkmate, to get your queen right into h7. So it's the neighbour of the kiss of death. And the reason it's called Damiano checkmate is because you do often give up your rook first. Now, here, white can also win by playing queen to h5. But my first thought in any tactical sequence is you should always look at the checks first, and this is a good lesson here. I mean, there's only two checks. Queen e5 check would lose your queen. The only other check is rook to h8 check, and black has one move. And now that the rook has got out of the way, the queen has access into the position. It can either go to h5 or to h1. For example, queen h1 check, and it's going to be checkmate very shortly on h7. So that is the basic Damiano puzzle. But there are a number of cases when this has occurred in games. I'm now going to show you an actual loss which I had when my opponent did the Damiano on me. And again, in order for him to play this brilliant tactic we're going to see, he must have been aware of this pattern. And that's one of the aims of this series. Once you're aware of the patterns, you'll spot the tactics more easily. So let's move on to this example now. So like I mentioned, this is a game I played. I had the black pieces here. And I was now playing, should I say now, I was playing who is now a very famous publisher of books, Jacob Agard, originally from Denmark, a grandmaster. He had white. Agard had just taken on e4. I took back with my f-pawn. And you may be thinking here, how on earth is this related to the Damiano technique? Well, what was the Damiano technique? Remember what I said, it's basically an open h-file and a pawn or a bishop on g6. And by looking at this position and looking at the most forcing moves and being able to realise the pattern that I've just shown you, you may be able to see a very dangerous sequence that white now played. And I have to say, it took me by a nasty surprise. Knight to g6 check, a fantastic move. Now, I really have to take that knight, otherwise I'm going to lose my bishop. And the point of this is, after the pawn takes g6, white is now setting up the typical Damiano technique. A pawn on g6, a rook on h1, and all he needs to try to do now, can you remember his next idea, is to get the queen into h7. I only have one move, king to g8. What should white do now? And this is quite an advanced example because it's not entirely straightforward. But if you remember the technique about getting the queen around, it should become clear. Queen to c1. Probably the same occurs as the queen going to d1 or to b1. The queen needs to have access to h1. Now, if white had tried something like rook to h5, with the idea of going rook to h1, this would have given me time to defend. And you always have to consider your opponent's best defense. And after rook to f6, I have time to take on g6 and run with my king to f7. Now, after queen to c1, this very excellent move, I can no longer play rook to f6 because of the Damiano attack. And can you remember how this attack occurs? White can force checkmate here in typical fashion. Rook to h8 check, the king has to take that, and now this queen comes in to that h7 square, queen h1 check, queen h7 check, and in this position, the black king is still blocked in, so queen to h8 delivers as a checkmate. After queen to c1, I'm in a pretty helpless situation. I tried queen to d8 with the idea of blocking the h-file with bishop to h4. My opponent played an interesting move here with bishop to c7, but he actually had a much stronger move than this. And it was a much more thematic move. Maybe you can improve on my grandmaster opponent's play here. What can white do now in order to force my resignation? There's nothing much I can do after a very forcing sequence. Again, pause if you need to. Well, bishop to c7 was okay, but there's no reason to stop the Damiano technique here. Rook to h8 actually works anyway. The point being, king takes, queen to h1 check. Now my king cannot move because the queen flies into h7. I have to play bishop to h4, and it looks like black might be okay here because the queen is defending the bishop, but after the move g5, well, it's clear to see that black is losing. There's not really any sufficient way to stop the white queen coming into h4, into h7, delivering mate, and desperate tries like queen takes g5 will leave black with a serious material deficiency. So this would have been the simplest way to win, and again, this whole technique is about getting the queen into your opponent's position. Now, one more example coming up of this pattern, a slightly different version of it from a very recent match. So let's move over there now. The last example I want to use in the Damiano pattern, just to demonstrate these patterns are not fantasy. They don't just happen on very rare occasions. They actually will happen quite regularly. If you know all of these patterns, they're probably going to occur in most of your games at some point. That's the key thing. The better you know them, the better prepared you'll be. And this game, at the time of me filming, is actually taken from yesterday. On the white side, we have Aronium. On the side of the black pieces, Nepanachi. And it's taken from the chess.com speed challenge, which I was very enjoying watching, a great competition on chess.com. And here, a slightly different technique, but I think it's the same idea. In this position, Aronian, now with the white pieces in a very complex position, played knight to e7 check. And amazing that these guys can see such tactics so quickly. It really mind-combobulates me. I love that word. I had to get it in. Combobulation. Love combobulation. And the point of this tactic is to release the bishop. And after knight takes e7, Aronian now played bishop takes e6 check. Now, actually, black resigned here. If he plays rook to f7, white is going to win too much material. He'll be a rook up. He'll win the game. And the whole point of black's resignation is that if he goes king to h8, can you see this slightly different version of the checkmate we're researching here? Remember, it's about the queen coming into h7 normally, but this has the same technique, the same pattern. And what I'm showing you here is that when you know the basic checkmates, you'll be able to slightly change them, hopefully. You'll be able to notice these aspects, the key aspects of them, and hopefully you'll be able to use them in your own games. That's the idea anyway. Doesn't always work for me, but hey-ho, it worked for Aronian here. The point of this is we need to open up the h-file. We need to get our queen to h1. So rook takes h7 check. And after king takes h7, we can now move our queen to h7 check. There's only one defense. Bishop to h6. And after bishop to h6, well, the queen flies in to h6 with checkmate. So again, a similar theme, I think, to the earlier two videos, or should I say the earlier topics of this one video. And again, I really like this checkmate. It's getting very pretty, and we've still got 10 more to go. So I hope you stay tuned for the rest of these pattern checkmates, and I enjoyed this one a lot. So let's move on. Well, hopefully you'll move on with me to another. Welcome to the 6th video in this mating range, and now we're going to look at the opera checkmate. Sorry, I was trying to do a bit of opera singing there, not good for the ears. But what is the opera checkmate? Well, the opera checkmate involves the rook and the bishop, and the rook comes flying down. Here we go, rook to d8, and it's defended by the bishop, trapping the enemy's king on the back rank. And there's always something in the way, so it can be any piece here on f7 trapping the king, except for a knight, because obviously a knight would be able to take the rook. And in this situation, the bishop is the piece that also traps the king in. So this is the basic version of the opera checkmate, and I'm now going to explain to you why it's called the opera checkmate and where it came about. So let's move on to the next game, and we have a very famous example of this checkmate in action. So there's quite an amusing story behind the name of this checkmate. Apparently it relates to this game and the position we're going to go through here, which was played in 1858 at an opera house in Paris. Morphy had the white pieces and he was playing against two opponents who took black. The first player was a German noble, the Duke of Brunswick, and also against the French, should we say, posh aristocrats. Lovely. And apparently they had a box at the opera. The opera was going on, but they were making so much noise in the box, which was right next to this opera, that the people in the opera, the performers, actually took a look to see what on earth was going on in the box. It was a chess game. It's like being at a football match, putting off the players because there's too much noise, but it was a chess game. So what is this checkmate? Well, let's have a look. Morphy was white, and here he played bishop to g5. And what this game really demonstrates is the power of pieces and quick development. Look at all the white's pieces, lovely develops. And here black flicks in b5, but the queen is trapping the king on e8, the bishop on f8 is trapped, and really black has horrendous pieces throughout his position. So it's time to sacrifice. Morphy plays knight takes b5. And the point of this is, after pawn takes, he has bishop takes b5 check. And now this black king is really open. He blocks with knight bd7, and Morphy increased the pressure with the natural move castles queenside, bringing the rook into the attack. Black defends by bringing his rook to d8, because there was a threat of bishop takes f6, followed by a capture on d7. And now, what should Morphy play, or what indeed did Morphy play? So put yourself in White's position here, and pause the video if you need to. What would you do here? And remember, getting all the pieces into the attack is key, even if you have to sacrifice, because Morphy wasn't afraid to sacrifice. Well, rook takes d7, another beautiful move, because this enables the rook on h1 to come in. Rook takes d7 from black, otherwise he'd lose the queen, and now rook to d1. And in this position, it's not really any good way to stop White taking on d7. Queen to e6 was played, and Morphy now played bishop takes d7 check. Again, black's move here is pretty much forced. Knight takes d7, and can you see in this position the beautiful tactic that Morphy used? And after his next two moves, we have the opera checkmate. So what did White do? Pause if you need to here. Queen to b8 check, removing the knight on d7 from its post, and after the only move, knight takes b8, we can see the combination of the bishop and the rook, and rook to d8 is indeed checkmate there. So a very nice example of the offered checkmate. And let's now look at one last case of this, just so we get a good feeling for really what this checkmate is all about. So we're now going to rely on our good friend Steinitz to demonstrate the opera checkmate. And this is a game he had against a chap called Vines, and black here played knight to a6. So you can see in this position, the black king is not in the centre of the board, but we can still create a version of the opera checkmate here. So imagine you're White. How can you try to get this combination of the rooks and the bishop, creating that net around the black king? If you need to pause the video, please do so now. Well, White needs to open up the bishop on f4 first, and there's something in the way of that bishop, the pawn, so d7 check is a very good move, opening up the bishop to the b8 square, and this is the key idea. There's only one move that black can play, and that's rook takes d7, and now, can you see the end? Rook to b8 check, the knight has to capture that rook, and rook takes b8 check, again demonstrates the opera checkmate. Slightly different to the last example, because we have a rook blocking the king's escape and not a pawn this time, but it's exactly the same concept of bishop and rook. So remember, if you have a bishop striking down across the enemy's king, and if you have a rook that can come down, you should be looking for this kind of pattern in your own games. And that is the opera checkmate. We now move on to the Arabian checkmate. And according to Chess Kids, this is the oldest checkmate ever invented. Can you believe it? And the name actually comes from an old version of chess, which was supposedly invented somewhere in Arabia, so hence the name. And the checkmate here involves a knight and the rook. And you can only do this when your opponent's king is stuck right in the corner of the board, as black's king is here. White to play, and this is the simplest version of the checkmate, goes rook takes h7, checkmate. And you can see here the knight does a fantastic job of not just defending the rook, but also taking away the g8 square from the opponent's king. So this is the basic version of the Arabian checkmate. Let's now have a look at a couple of cases where this has actually occurred in some real games. So this is taken from a real game, competitive game, and a very important open. With the white pieces, you have a grandmaster from Armenia, and he's playing a lower-rated player, but Berg here is still 2200. Now, it's white to play, and I'm really just trying to give you examples from real games where you can try to work out how to set up the pattern I first show you. So in this position, you can see that white has a knight kind of hovering around the enemy king there. And he also has the two rooks. But it kind of seems impossible to create the Arabian checkmate here, because black has quite a solid position. His two pawns defend the king, and as well as the two pawns, you have the knight and the rook. So what is the key thing to do in lots of these positions? Well, if you sense you might have one of these checkmates on the horizon, and again, this is why you really should look at as many examples as you can and practice them yourself. Try to even create these checkmates yourself with your own chessboard. Set up your own checkmates. Say, I'm going to make 5 Arabian checkmates today. What a brilliant way to learn. But what you need to do is to look for the most forcing moves when it gets near to the end of the game. What are the most forcing moves? Checks. There's one check here that starts the whole combination off. So try to work out the checkmate. Pause now if you need to. Well, the way to continue here is by getting the knight to the critical square, and in the Arabian checkmate, the knight needs to be on this square here, in this particular case. And you can do it at any corner of the board, of course, so the knight would have to be on one of these 3 highlighted squares. So C3, F3, F6, or C6. But of course, when your knight goes to those squares, the opponent's enemy king has to be in the corner of the board, so on one of these squares. And in this position, the black king needs to be forced into H8, so we go knight to F6 check, only one possibility, king to H8, and now we need to use brute force to open it up even more. So how can we get rid of the pawns on G7 and H6? Well, rook takes H6, bang! Crashing through. If the knight blocks, we do rook takes H7, and that is one form of the Arabian mate. And if pawn takes rook, which is another possibility, but it's the same result, the rook comes down to G8. And again, this is a slightly different version to the last Arabian mates because we have our rook on the back rank, not on the 7th rank, but again, it's exactly the same principle with the pattern. And this checkmate is the oldest checkmate in chess, but it's also one of the most beautiful. So let's have a look at one more case where this has occurred in a real game. I found the following example of Arabian mates, and we're going to pick it up from a middle game position, just to see the whole build-up of an attack and how these combinations can lead to these patterns we're concentrating on. Well, first of all, have a look at white's pieces here. They look so scary. Every single white piece is hovering around that poor little black king on G8. They all want to have a piece of the action. You've got the 2 rooks, which have swung their way around. You have the white queen, and the knight and the bishop, everything hovering around the king. Now, if you know how to set up the Arabian mate, you should work out where the knight needs to go. So where does that knight need to go? Well, that knight needs to travel into F6. So the knight here plays to H5 first, threatening to come into F6, which should win the queen. Black decides to tuck the king on H8, and the knight dives in anyway. And the knight is now on a much more aggressive and attacking square on F6, threatening a number of nasty ideas against black's king. Black has to move the queen, so the queen now decides it's safe on D8. Well, it's time to do something forcing here. You've got the knight to the best square. Everything is set against the black king. Look at black's pieces as well. Black's pieces are tucked over on the queen's side. And another thing you've got to get in the habit of doing is when you're trying to create these attacks, when you're trying to force checkmate, when you're trying to kill your opponents, don't just look at your own pieces, look at your enemy's pieces. If your enemy's pieces are on the other side of the board, not being able to defend the king, then you can smell that anticipation of an impending attack, an exploding attack about to occur, and you're going to have much more likelihood of succeeding with an attack. And that's the case here. Well, there's 2 ways to finish the game now. And again, do pause if you want to try to work it out for yourself. So, the first way is not the move play, but it's a beautiful idea. Queen takes G6. And this is trying to force open the H-file. The point here is there's a major threat of either the queen or the bishop coming to G7. And if black takes on G6, can you see how you can force checkmate now? You need to move the bishop out of the way. There's only one square. bishop to f8 check. This is the correct square because you need to keep control of g7. And after rook h7, rook takes rook would be checkmate there. So that is the first way that white could have won. In the game, white picked a different way. I quite like the way white did it because he was looking for checks, and checks are even more forcing the captures. So when you're trying to force a situation, you should be looking at checks first. Bishop to g7 check. The point of this is really just to get the bishop out of the way. Black has 2 recaptures. And I would suggest now, if you haven't seen the end of the game, work out all the way to the finish. So pause now. Well, if king takes g7, we can take on h7 with check, and if we keep checking with the king, we can see that queen takes g6 will lead to mate. So black decided his best bet was rook takes g7, and now an amazing idea, an idea we've seen previously. Queen takes g6, and you're just trying to divert the rook away from defense of h7, setting up the Arabian mate. If rook takes g6, rook takes h7, again, is a demonstration of the world's oldest checkmate. So what else can be done here for black? Well, the threat, and we've always got to try to create threats when we're attacking, and we have done here. We're creating a threat of taking on h7, even with the queen or the rook. It doesn't matter. Each way leads to a version of the Arabian checkmate. So really, black has to defend h7 again. So queen to e7. But now he's left the g8 square undefended. So rook takes h7 check, clears half, only one move, rook takes h7. Can you see the end? Queen to g8 check, and now yet another version of this Arabian checkmate. Look how many pieces white has sacrificed. It doesn't matter because he's cleared the path and created something he should be truly proud of. So a very nice checkmate, one of my favourites, the Arabian checkmate, but still plenty more to go. So let's move on to another one in the next video. And do remember to look at We now move on to Morphy's checkmate. Why Morphy's checkmate? You know what? I have no idea. I think it's because nearly every checkmate is named after the great man, and this one, well, it must have occurred in one of his early games. So what is Morphy's checkmate? Well, it's a checkmate you can do when your opponent's king is stuck in the corner of the board, as the black king is stuck here, and it combines your rook and your bishop. And this simple example, where it's white to move and white can play bishop takes f6, giving Morphy's checkmate. And here the bishop attacks the king, and you can see the king is trapped by the pawn on h7 and the rook on g1. So this is a very basic example of Morphy's checkmate. It actually occurs in quite a lot of games, this kind of pattern. And we're now going to look at an actual case from a real game. So let's move over there now. So now an example from the great Nimzovich with the white pieces here. And in this position, it was black to move, and black here plays the only move he can do, because otherwise it'd be a piece down. Rook takes d6. So white has 3 pieces attacking, the bishop, rook, and queen, against what I say is quite a badly defended king there on g8, because there's not really many pieces defending that king. And in this position, Nimzovich comes up with an absolutely fantastic idea, maybe being a student of Morphy's games, which I would not be surprised if he was. So can you see the idea here, which tries to create Morphy's mate? And one of the things, I think is so important about these videos is to really picture those mating positions, because once you get used to them, you'll be able to see how you can arrive at them, how you can create them in your own games. And chess is all about patterns. It's all about mesmerizing, memorizing, creating patterns. And that's what you should do here. So it's white to move. Pause video now. Well, in this position, white can give up the queen but force checkmate. And the right move is the amazing queen to f6, an absolutely brilliant move, because now the queen is threatening to give checkmate on g7. And the only way black can try to play on here is by playing queen takes bishop. But after queen takes queen, you can see that white's easily going to win this position. And what else can black do? Well, queen takes g7 is a major threat. And if you play pawn takes queen, now you can see Morphy's mate being created around the black king. Look for the checks, rook g4 check, pushing that king into the corner, and once that king goes in the corner, we take on f6 and we have this version of Morphy's mate. The bishop and rook really trapping that king like a wild animal in a trap there in the corner of the board. So I'm just going to give you one more example of Morphy's mate, and I had a bit of a loose end, so I actually created this example myself. Just from my own mind. So excuse me if it's a load of rubbish, but hey ho, we've got to have a bit of fun now and again. So let's have a look at a last example of Morphy's mate now. So as I mentioned, for this last example of Morphy's mate, you're going to like dive into my brain for a little bit. I'm sorry there. It's a very scary place. We're taking the white pieces here, and we're trying to force checkmate against black. So again, get your thinking cap on now. You know the final pattern. So what you've got to do is just work backwards, try to create that final pattern. Look for the most forcing moves first. And in actual fact, white has a number of strong moves in this position. For example, something along the lines of rook g3 might be quite good, but you've also got to be careful you don't play bishop takes f6 here, which is a little trap I set up, because now you're going to fall into the back rank checkmate, queen to e1. So there's a bit of care needed. But really, in these examples, when you're trying to attack your opponent's king with as much force as possible, and here white has a bishop, queen, and rook all attacking, you should be looking at the most forcing moves. The most forcing moves in chess are checks. So you start by looking at the checks. There's only one check here. Can you see the checkmate? I'm going to ask you to pause now. Try to work out all the way to the end. Please pause. Well, the forced checkmate is queen takes g7 check. And again, remember, with Morphy's mate, you're trying to retain your bishop and your rook. So the queen actually doesn't matter so much. Only one move, king takes g7. And here we play rook to g3 check. The knight cannot block that check because it's pinned to the king. And black has two options here, but they're both completely helpless. If the king goes into the corner, this is a pure version of Morphy's checkmate. Bishop takes f6 is checkmate. And if the king comes the other way, let's say it comes to h6, then now we have a very strong move with bishop d2. And it's going to be checkmate next move. The black king is stuck there. In actual fact, a good way to practice, which I may recommend to you guys watching these videos, is if you want to try to get really the grips of all of these checkmates, why don't you create your own? Why don't you get a checkboard out and say, right, checkboard? Well, you could get a checkboard out. Get a chessboard instead. Why don't you get a chessboard out and say, right, I'm going to create an example of Morphy's mate and try to put it on the position on the board where it is white to play and to force a checkmate. And you can do this with the other patterns I'm demonstrating here. It's a good way to use your imagination and to reinforce these patterns which I'm trying to teach in these videos. So give that a go. I think it'd be a very good thing to do. Still more videos in this series, loads more to come. Hope you're enjoying them. So we're looking at checkmate pattern number 12, and this one you may have heard of as Boden's mate. I also call it the crisscross mate. It's named after the player Samuel Boden, who played a famous example, and we're going to start with that example here. And the first, I would say, time this was made famous was in this game, and it was in London in 1853. His opponent with the white pieces was Skolder. But in actual fact, there was an earlier case of this Boden mate, and it was previously seen in the game between Holwich and Poppert in Hamburg 1844. So I always find it strange when something is given a name but it was played earlier. I find it a bit unfair on the person who first played it. But this is a very nice example to get us kicked off. So in this position, quite a dynamic position, white played queen to f3. We're just going to see the build up here. Black now moved his bishop to an active square, bishop to f5, where it kind of cuts across the board there. And white has a difficult decision to make. if he castles kingside, he's going to be open on the G file. So he decides to castle queenside, but this has some major problems as well. And black came up with an absolutely fantastic move now. Maybe you can also be a Bowden here, or a crisscrosser, and spot what black played in this position. And it's really to do this mate with the two bishops, as we're going to see. And again, to get a real expert in these mating techniques, you've got to really notice your good pieces and relate them to the checkmates you're trying to arrange. So what is the move here? Pause if you need a bit of time. D5, a brilliant pawn sacrifice, and the point of this move is to open up the bishop on f8. And this crisscross checkmate is to do with the two bishops. So white decided now to take the pawn on d5, and it doesn't matter what he takes this pawn with. And the point of this is now black can force checkmate. Can you see how now? Queen takes c3, a brilliant queen sacrifice. Has to be accepted, pawn takes c3, and now the bishop on f8 flies into glory, bishop to a3, checkmate. And you can see here the pattern of the two bishops, hence why I call it the criss-cross checkmate. The bishops are crossing and crissing, whatever crissing means, not sure, made it up, who knows, and you give checkmate in this very nice way. So this is something that occurs occasionally, this checkmate. It can occur in different sort of positions, but most often when one player has castle queenside and you have a very strong bishop, like here, the bishop on f5, cutting across that king. So watch out for it in those cases. But we'll have a look at another example now from a real game. We now have an example of this from a very modern example, should I say, just to prove that all these puzzles don't just occur in the 1800s or the 1700s. They are actually very relevant to today. And this is taken from the chess.com chess challenge, played when I filmed this video very recently in 2017, August. And we have MVL, Maxime Vachier-Lagrave, playing with the black pieces against Jeffrey Jean. And here it's black to play. And this was only a 1-minute game. It was a bullet game, so even more impressive. But here, it's black to play and force checkmate. And hopefully, you can now see the pattern. Even if you haven't seen it before, can you notice this pattern? Black to play and force checkmate. So what should you be seeing when you're looking for these things? Well, first of all, we have this bishop here, like before, but on the other side of the board, cutting across the king. So if there's some way we can get the other bishop to crisscross its way in, it will deliver checkmate. And you should be able to see it's the same kind of technique here. Queen takes f3 check. That has to be accepted. And now, because the g-pawn has been removed, we can crisscross with bishop h3 checkmate. So a very, very nice, and I expect very satisfying checkmate that MVL was able to do on his opponent there. And we've got one more example of the crisscross coming up, and it's a little bit more complicated. So let's move over there now. This last example, we're going back in the past again. Sorry about that. But we're looking at two great players, two heroes of the game. Nimzovich with the white pieces against Alexander Alekhine with black. And this just demonstrates again how in seemingly positions where these things could never occur, there's always underlying tactics. Now, Nimzovich here castled queenside. And at first glance, this may seem like a dubious idea, because surely the pawn on d4 can now be taken, because black has 1, 2, 3 pieces attacking this pawn. But you can't take this pawn. In the game, Alexander played bishop to d6, a good move. But let's see what happens if he'd have tried taking the pawn. So let's see. Okay, takes on d4, and now Nimzovich was planning to recapture, and now knight takes d4. And there was an extremely brilliant and clever idea that Nimzovich had up his sleeve here. Can you be a Nimzovich just for one day? Can you see what white had planned here? And remember this pattern of the crisscross. The bishop here, this is what your brain should really be noticing. It's crossing the path of the king. So the alarm bell should be ringing. But how on earth here can you possibly get a bishop to a6? It seems like that is just not going to happen, but it can. Pause now if you need to. Well, what we can play here, we can first sacrifice the exchange. Rook takes d4, when black really has to take that. And now we are able to bring our queen into e6. Queen takes e6 check. And the most natural move here is knight to d7. And maybe black thinks he's just about holding on. But here we have the very strong bishop on f4, and we can force checkmate. Can you see it? Queen to c6 check. Beautiful example. The queen has to be taken, and again, we've opened up the other diagonal towards the king, bishop to a6, and again, we have the crisscross Boden's checkmate, even though I think Boden was a little bit greedy taking this checkmate for himself. So, a very nice checkmate, and I think if you ever get... Have you ever seen someone in the army standing there, very nice, with his military uniform on? On both of his shoulders, he has some visual thing. You know, like the sort of things that go down saying he's got an award on his shoulders, if you know what I mean? Well, this checkmate is named after the shoulders of military uniforms. It's called the epaulet checkmate. And in this position, this is a very basic example of it, black to move goes queen to e6. Checkmate. And you can see that the king here could be the person in the uniform. On either side of the king, his shoulders are taken away the escape squares, hence the epaulet checkmate. Both rooks are next to the king, basically, you know, just keeping it suffocated there on its square, its starting square. So an interesting checkmate, this one, epaulets. And, you know, you have to wonder where these names come from, who comes up with them. I couldn't find the information for this myself, but it's the concept I'm really concentrating on. So we're going to now move over to the world champion, who has managed to use this checkmate in a very beautiful game. So let's have a look at this game now. So we pick up this game with Magnus Carlsen having the white pieces and in the middle of a vicious attack against his grandmaster opponent from Holland. And Magnus Carlsen here, who has got an open h-file, a very active queen, and a bishop ready to explode that king, away, should we say, plays bishop takes h6. And this removes another defender of the black king. Now, what can black do here? Well, black goes pawn takes bishop, and the point of Magnus's combination is a brilliant move. Rook takes h6 check, sacrificing a second piece. This is why the guy is world champion. Only one move, knight takes h6, but now the knight is no longer defending the bishop. And Magnus plays queen takes e7. So Magnus is using a combination of brute force here and creating threats at the same time. Force and threats, and it combined with very accurate calculation. The threat here is queen to h7, checkmate. So black is really has to put a piece on to f7. So he puts the knight onto f7. Magnus takes that knight off, and even though black is a rook up, look at the king. There's an open h-file towards the king. The queen can also come around and attack the king as well. So this rook doesn't matter so much here. Maybe if black's queen was on the other side of the board, so let's put that queen all the way on g6, he'd be able to defend here. But that is not the case. And again, these little, should we say, instruments of attack should be warning bells for you when you're looking for these combinations. Look at your opponent's pieces, look at ways to rip open your opponent's king, and make sure your calculation is good. Exactly what Magnus does here. Black has to stop queen to f6 check, so he goes king to g7. And now Magnus really needs to get his rook into the attack. He's not going to checkmate just with the queen. So he does a typical technique. Rook d3, the rook swinger. The rook comes around the angles. Black tries to give his king a bit of protection with rook d6, trying to put the rook in front of the king and setting a bit of a nasty trap there. What would happen if Magnus played queen takes d6? Well, queen to e1, and it would be Magnus who gets checkmated. But instead, he looks for the most aggressive moves, which are checks. Rook to g3 check. Now, if the king moves to the h-file, Magnus will put his queen on h4 at the right moment, delivering checkmate. So he has to play rook to g6. And here Magnus continues with queen to e5 check, and he's calculated extremely well here. What can black do here? Well, black can either take the pawn on f7 or move the king to the h-file. The problem black is, if he ever moves to the h-file, he's going to be setting himself up for a check along that file. For example, king to h7, and now the most accurate way to win is queen to h5 check, threatening to capture the rook, forcing rook to f6, and now you just keep looking at the most forcing moves. This is what you need to do when you build up your combinational vision. Look for the checks. Queen f5 check, king h8. Only one good check. Queen e5 check. And now it's checkmate. Queen to g7 checkmate. So a very complicated combination here. But we're going to see how it arrives at our checkmate. After king takes f7, Magnus now played queen to f5 check. And he's trying to win the rook on g6. Only one way to stop that, rook to f6. And what can Magnus now play? Can you see the move? Queen to d7. And this is an example of the Capulet checkmate. In this position, the black king, should we say the soldier, has his he has his soldiers here, meaning he can't escape. He's trapped parallel by these two pieces, and a very nice version of this checkmate, because in actual fact in this version the king is not on the back rank, but it's trapped by the opposing rook. So another example of this pattern in action. And let's just have a look at one more case of this before we move on to another video. Our last example of this checkmate, again taken from a very high class, high rated encounter. With the white pieces you've got Luke van Wely, King Luke as also known, who's the strongest player in Holland, has been for a number of times, well, until Geary came along, but he's a veteran of the chessboard. With the black pieces, one of the most imaginative players of all time, Alexander Morozevich. In this position, Luke blunders with rook to f1. And you can see here this pattern. And this is, again, what you've got to start to realize in order to be able to use these techniques in your games. Here, the king is stuck on this square because it has a rook on either side of it. And this is the thing where your alarming bell should be going, I can see my opponent's king is stuck like that. So how do I get a piece into the right square, delivering checkmate? And this is really what these sort of checkmate patterns are all about. It's nice knowing the names, but the names are not important. Who cares what they're called? It's more important to understand the piece arrangements, to understand the patterns. When you see these patterns coming together on the board, get those alarm bells ringing. Can you take advantage of these patterns? Can you force your way through? And this is a basic example of that. It's black to play and win. Can you see the killer technique here, the killer combination? Pause now if you need to. Rook to g8 check, a lovely move. And in this position, white resigned. The point is, he's got to take that rook. And now queen to g7 is checkmate. Another lovely example of this checkmate. There's plenty more videos to come. I'll see you soon for another video. Welcome to another checkmate pattern. And now this is our 11th pattern of checkmates. We're going to have a look at one called the dovetail. And this was certainly one I wasn't aware of before coming up with these puzzles and these examples I'm taking you through. But it's a reasonably, I would say, common one. And what the dovetail is, if you look at the position in front of us here, it involves the queen. So the queen dives into a checkmate position. So this is a very simple example of the dovetail. White to move. There's one way to checkmate, which I'm sure you can all see. Queen to c6. And really what the dovetail is, it's the queen giving checkmate to the opposing king and the queen being supported by something. Quite often a pawn, as in this example. This is the pure dovetail. But you could also have similar patterns with, let's say, a knight, if the knight was on d4, or even another piece somewhere, maybe even a bishop on e8 guarding that queen. So I'm not entirely sure where this name came from. I did a little bit of research, but I expect it's called the dovetail because if you take a dove, obviously the tail of the dove's meant to be sort of queen, kind of blooming, kind of looking a little bit like a queen, you could say. And maybe the body of a dove is a small, finer thing, like the pawn. So this is the basic dovetail. And now we're going to have a look at some examples from real games where this has actually won the moment for one player. So let's move on to an example now. So we join a position here from a game with Greco of the white pieces, and quite an old game here in the King's Gambit. Well, I say King's Gambit, but it's not a King's Gambit without f4, but it's a King's Gambit kind of attack here. It reminds me of a King's Gambit with the queen on h5 and the bishop flying in with the opposing king in a bad position. White has just played bishop to g5, attacking the queen on e7. So black has to do something about this. So queen in this position comes back to e8. And you can see here white has three very dangerous attacking pieces. The queen, which is near the black king, the bishop on g5, and also this very strong bishop on c4. Again, this bishop on c4 is often a very important attacking piece in the King's Gambit. So that, you've got to try to really pick up these patterns. And you should get into a position when you advance in chess where you recognize ideas, you recognize pieces from other positions. And that's what's happening here. The black king is also weak because it doesn't have any pawn protection. Now white continued attacking with queen to f3 check. There's no adequate way to block that check. So the king has to move king to g7. And now white played bishop takes g8. And in this position, really, I would say a bit of an amateur mistake from black. Black should try to fight on with king takes bishop, but instead he goes rook takes bishop. And it should be pretty clear to see here how white can do the dovetail checkmate. And by the way, if any of you say this during a game, I give you bonus points. If you actually do the dovetail and you say, dovetail checkmate, here we come on the board, I will give you a free DVD. So what is the checkmate? Queen to f6. And again, the tail of the dove is the queen. It's checking the king. This time it's supported by the bishop, and black's king can't move anywhere. So we'll have a look at one more final example of this checkmate, a little bit more complex, and then hopefully you guys will move on to the next video in this series with me. This final example, taken from a real game, involves one of my favourite players of all time, David Bronstein. And if you haven't heard of David Bronstein, you should really look at some of his games. He's one of the most imaginative players in the world. He never became the world champion, but he came extremely close, only just losing an important match against Botvinnik, which he probably should have won. And here he's sacrificed a piece. As we can see, white's got the extra bishop, but the white king is in a very weak situation. So let's see how now, with Bronstein to move, he pressurized the king. Well, first of all, he played queen f3 check, and now king g1 was played. And how do we increase the pressure? Well, I've talked about this quite a lot in the past, and it's something I hope you're aware of if you see my streams. We need to, we can't checkmate just with the queen. That's impossible. You need to bring in all your pieces. So the rook on f8 is not doing anything. Let's get that in the game. Rook f6, and that is the rook swinger, swinging around into the action. And here, there's a nasty threat of rook g6 check and maybe queen g2. White tries to defend with bishop f2. And the point is, after rook check, the king comes to f1. But this does not help. Black can now do the dovetail checkmate. Can you see how white can not stop black's checkmate in 2 moves? So it's black to play and checkmate in 2 moves. And remember, if you do this checkmate, you have to say dovetail when you play the move. You get bonus points, Ask the arbiter for an extra point if you say it during the game. And if you get thrown out of the competition, well, I don't take responsibility. Just to, just point out. So it is now queen to h3 check. You're forcing the white king into the open. And it may look like the white king is getting away here, but you should notice these patterns. This is what this kind of little series is all about. We have a pawn, and that pawn supports 2 squares. And here the queen can come over to d3, and again, this time it's a black dove, but the black dove's tail is supported by the little pawn, and it's another version of the dovetail checkmate. So do try these out yourself. Do try to create your own puzzles, like I mentioned before, when you're at home on your own. And also, you know, in the chat below, if you can, maybe, you know, mention some positions, some games where these have actually occurred. You know, share examples yourselves. And, you know, I think this series could really help you get the pattern. Now we come to another one of my personal favourite checkmates, and you may or may not have seen this one, but when I first saw this, it just brought a lot of pleasure to my chess soul, should I say. And anyone who says that chess is not an art hasn't got some, you know, beauty to it. Show them this checkmate, and how can they deny it? How can they deny there's no beauty in chess? And the funny thing is, maybe you'll notice this pattern from a modern Disney film. That's a bit of trivia for you. It was actually seen in Disney's latest movie, Queen of Qatar. And the queen there actually does this checkmate to win a great prize during one of her games. It's a checkmate generally where you use your queen and your knight, but it's always the knight that delivers the checkmate. And it's always the knight coming into a square where your opponent's king is stuck in the corner. And the reason it's called smothered mate is in this position, if you come in with knight to f7 check, which of course is an obvious and good move, it's not checkmate because the black king has the g8 square. So the black king can move to g8. So what you have to do, if we go back to the original position, is somehow force a structure where the black king is smothered by its own pieces. So where there's a rook on g8. Now, if you play the ridiculous looking queen to g8 check in this position, black has two options. He can either take with the rook or with the king. Now, taking with the rook is what we want black to do, because now the black king is smothered and knight to f7 is checkmate. But king takes g8 would leave the white player of the white pieces looking very embarrassed here. So the best way to do this smothered mate is to go knight to f7 check. And this is the pattern you need to remember. Knight and queen are tremendous attacking units. King has to go to g8, and now we go for a double check. How can we do that? Knight to h6 check, double check. Check from the queen and the knight. Now the black king has two squares it can go to. But if it goes to f8, we have the so-called kiss of death checkmate. The white queen flying in there, supported by the knight, checkmate. So black can try king to h8, and is there a way now we can smother it? Well, yes, there is. We can now move our queen in. Hello, there we go. Check. Looks like a ridiculous move. And I think in the Disney film at this point, the player who was playing the Queen of Qatar suddenly started laughing and saying, "You've lost your queen. Are you crazy?" Because you can't take this with the king now, because the knight is defending. This is the key point. But you can take the rook. And she was looking extremely smug until that knight jumped into f7. Boom! Checkmate. Smothered mate. So this is a very pretty checkmate. And to do this checkmate, you generally have to sacrifice, but there are different versions of it. And let's have a look at two more occasions where this has occurred. So another example of this smothered checkmate from a real game. And I must admit, I haven't heard of the two players except for this position. And it's another beautiful example of this technique. Now, again, when you're picking up these patterns, you should be looking for things that get your alarm bells ringing. So what here should be getting your alarm bell ringing? Well, really, it's the combination of, I would say, mainly the queen and the knight here, these two pieces here. And there are two ways to do this. Can you spot both ways of creating smothered mates here? One way is, I would say, very similar, if not the same as the way we looked at. But can you see the second way? There's two ways of forcing checkmate through checks. And I would suggest you pause now and try to solve this yourself. Well, the first way here is, I would say, the traditional way where you just use the queen and knight. And again, this is the kind of pattern you've got to realize. The opponent's king is in the corner. I've got a queen and knight near. This square f7 is really weak. So let's use it. Let's do the pattern. Knight to f7 check, king to g8, and now we do the same pattern we just looked at. Double check, knight to h6 check, and again the king has not much choice here. King to h8, and now can you remember how we finish this off? Boom! Queen to g8 check, and now the king cannot take the queen. Rook takes, and now we smother the king. Knight to f7 check. But did you see the other way to do this? The other way to do this checkmate is by actually playing queen to g8 check first. And the reason this works in this particular case, and this is what white played, showing off a little bit, is that the bishop on c4 gives some extra options. Now, if rook takes queen, knight to f7, checkmate. And if king takes queen, well, hopefully you can see the checkmate now. Still a little bit difficult to see. We're looking for double checks. Knight to e7 check is the correct move. Double check from the knight and bishop. Black king only has two options. If it goes to h8, we smother it. Knight to f7 check. These two knights creating an awfully powerful net around the king. And if the king goes to f8, it's checkmate now in two moves. Can you see it? Well, either knight goes to at g6, this knight or the other knight, and after pawn takes, knight takes, we have got the king in what I'd say is an example of the smothered mate here. The king cannot escape anywhere. And if you watch my last video on Boden's mate, the crisscross, this actually has some similarities. The bishop here is cutting across the king, and rather than having a bishop attacking the king, it's now a knight. And this is something, again, you've got to notice in order to get better. Notice similarities in puzzles, pick up the puzzles, look for examples of puzzles, try to create your own puzzles, get the more information, get your brain working, and then you'll be much quicker at calculating them in real games. So one more very quick final example of smother mate, and then I suggest you move on to my other puzzles. This next example from Steinitz, obviously one of the strongest players in that time. He was world champion, let's not forget. I would say we could also call this the suffocation mate. In this particular case, it's not the same pattern, but it's suffocating our opponent's king and using our knight. So try to play in the white pieces here. White has sacrificed the queen to get this position. And what you've got to try to do here is get a check against the king. Now, one basic way to get a winning position here would be knight to e7 check. And this would force queen takes knight, rook takes queen, and here we're quite easily winning. But there's actually a way to show off here, and you can win in a quicker form. And that is by playing rook to e3. And again, it's a rook swinger. We see this a lot in attacking techniques. The rook is aiming to come over to g3. That would be checkmate. Blackhead only has one way to stop that, queen to c7. And it's white to play and force checkmate in two moves now. And there's two different ways of doing this, and you can swap the moves about. What would you play here? Well, one way is rook to g3 check. Black has to give up his queen to stop the mate, but now e7 is left undefended, so the knight comes in there. And again, it's a bit like a smother mate. I call it suffocation mate, this one. And the other way is just if you swap the move order about. So knight to e7 check, and here queen takes e7 is forced, and now the g3 square is not taken, so the rook can come there. And this shows an important technique when calculating. When you're looking at puzzles, you're trying to calculate if things work. You should start with one variation first. Let's say that rook g3 did not work, and if it didn't work, it does, then you should try to swap the order of moves about. Then you should look at knight to e7, and by doing this, it can help you improve your calculation.